Okay, so let's jump into this week's workshop, all about mental models for running your business. And I think that it's important to maybe just state from the outset that there's no one set way of running your business and using particular frameworks. But I think mental models are a great way to think about helping in aiding decision making in particular, and having a frame of reference for making decisions that are going to be beneficial to you and your business on a holistic level in the long run. And I think having a bank of mental models, as we'll look at in a few moments, to be able to continuously reference while making decisions and considering different variables on a daily basis, you are hopefully going to be able to set yourself up for success and build upon that foundation of frameworks that you are operating under. So for this workshop, we're going to quickly look at what is a mental model and frameworks for decision making. Then we're going to look at building your lattice work and expanding the number of mental models maybe that you're able to reference, and how we can layer those on top of each other to give ourselves a better way for making decisions. And finally, we're going to look at 5 mental models for running your business. And this will actually be the bulk of what the workshop is about. So 5 mental models that we can use to build a foundation for improved decision making and ergo improved outcomes as a result, hopefully. So what is a mental model? And like we said already, I think we can think of a mental model as something we carry around with ourselves as we experience the world, and then leverage it to interpret relationships between things. So mental models, they're not, we don't need to use them as a perfect reference point for every decision, but they can definitely help us to coherently visualize complex problems and then think about how we're actually going to come up with a solution to those problems and act as a bank that we can continuously reference on an ongoing basis. So a simple mental model to think about, if you're unfamiliar with them, is something like supply and demand. Is a very, very simple mental model that we use to determine the economics of a given market. We've got a supply side, we've got a demand side, and we can conceptualize a market with those two variables, and the need for your product or business within that market will depend on if there's an over index of supply or an over index of demand, and hopefully you can meet a sweet spot there. So that's one example of a mental model that we can think about. Another example would be something simple like the Pareto principle. So the 80-20 model, where 20% of all of your efforts actually lead to about 80% of the results, and vice versa. And it's, again, another simple way to think about something that you're doing on a daily basis, and what are the outputs and results that are as a result of what you're actually carrying out. So building your lattice work is what we'll talk about next. And this is really about building a foundation of mental models that's going to help you to have a more rich database of frameworks and models that you can reference when making decisions. And I think when your worldview is dominated by, when a certain worldview dominates your thinking, you'll try to explain every problem you face through that worldview. And again, we can think of worldviews here as a particular mental model. And if we're limiting ourselves to one certain worldview that's very strict, that we're continuously using to maneuver our way through the experience of building a business, then we're kind of limiting ourselves. And having a more rich database and a more rich data set of models that we can reference will give us a better way of hopefully considering different variables to make better decisions. So we don't want to rely on too few mental models. And if we do, we'll start applying them indiscriminately to every problem that we have. So we'll try to say, okay, I have this view of how a business should be run, and this is the way that we're going to solve every problem because of that. And I think that's a limiting way of looking at what you're trying to do. And by layering mental models on top of one another, we're able to give ourselves a more rich palette of models to be able to make more informed decisions. So again, it's going to help increase our effectiveness as an efficient operator and make better decisions. So we're going to look at 5 mental models very briefly that we can use as a kind of foundation for helping making decisions in everyday activities related to our business. So the Eisenhower Matrix is a very simple decision-making framework that we can use to help decide how we want to prioritize certain tasks and how we should conduct those on a daily, weekly basis. So it's a very simple 2x2 matrix, and it helps to prioritize tasks by urgency and importance. And again, it's designed to speed up decision making and help you really focus on what you should be doing right now versus what you should be putting on the back burner or not prioritizing as much. So with the matrix, we've got important and urgent, and then it's broken down into 4 quadrants. So if a task is important and urgent, you should do it immediately because it's going to have a high impact and it is extremely important to get done. If a task is not important but urgent, it can be delegated to someone else or put on the back burner for a little bit of time. If it's not urgent and important, we should schedule a time to do it later and decide that it is not an urgent matter that needs to be resolved, and there's going to be not as much of an opportunity cost as if that particular decision was important and urgent. And then finally, if it's not important and not urgent, you should eliminate it or just completely forget about it because there's not going to be a high impact on your business and it's not something that needs to be taken care of straight away. So the Eisenhower Matrix is just a way for you to prioritize your tasks. And if you have a task list of 20 different things you need to do, using this matrix to decide, is it both urgent and important? Is it not important? Is it not urgent? Filling those 20 tasks into the different quadrants here and then saying, okay, this clearly shows me now what I need to do today, tomorrow, versus at the end of the week or next week. And again, it's just a nice way to help visualize things that you need to prioritize and get done with making your decisions. So that's the Eisenhower Matrix. Next is network effects. And we've spoken about this multiple times before, but a product displays positive network effects when more usage of the product by any user increases the product value for other users. And the internet itself is a perfect example of network effects in action, in that when there is one computer on a network or 2 computers, it's very low value. And the more computers and the more people you begin connecting to that network, the more value that there is for everybody on that network. And that value begins to increase exponentially over time as more and more people are connected. And those who joined the network in the early stages are continuously getting the compounding value and benefits of that network as it grew from a very early stage. Again, the phone network is another perfect example of this with, let's say, the cell network, and when that all came online in the 90s and people were actually joining the networks, and if you didn't have a certain amount of people who had cell phones, you couldn't contact them, obviously, but the more people that got cell phones and began to use the network, the more valuable it became because more and more people had them, more people could contact each other on a remote basis. And again, it's a compounding effect that's going to continue to add more users. It's a compounding effect that's going to essentially give more value to you in the long run. And if we think about this through the lens of you building your business, once again, you can apply it to a number of different variables, but let's say content as an example. If you're creating content and community around the business that you're building, the more people who are within that community and helping to either contribute to your content or create content. Let's scrap the content community idea and let's just look at community as a means of leveraging network effects in the early stages. Because if you've got a small cohort of people that begin using your product and you can tap into their extended networks as well, you can begin to continuously leverage the network effects of other people's networks that will help ultimately spread your business and through word of mouth and person-to-person marketing. And I think, again, social networks like Facebook are a prime example of how this played out over time with the growth of those types of platforms in the mid-2000s and late 2000s and all the way over the past 10, 15 years. It's been so interesting to see the strength of the network effects for something like that. And again, even looking at the internet itself and the phone networks are just prime examples of how network effects begin to really take hold, the more you compound the number of users who are getting value from a particular network. So again, it's worth thinking about this in relation to how can I get people on board in the early stages, really give value to those early stage users, and see how that can begin to extrapolate into their networks and continue to evolve and grow from there. So next, we're going to look at the flywheel effect. And again, this is, it's an effect that it's a mental model that we can think about for creating almost kind of like viral loops for our business and growth loops, as we'll see in the image below. But it's something that Amazon used to great effect with regards to how they've grown their business and how it has garnered the flywheel effect over time and actually began to kind of feed back into itself and become self-perpetuating. But essentially, it comes back to a book that was written by Jim Collins a number of years ago, and it was about the good to great model that we've spoken about before. And the means by which he was explaining how to visualize momentum was using something that he called the flywheel effect. And since then, it has been developed to kind of encompass momentum, feedback loops, compounding returns, and direction. And in the model, you can see on the bottom right-hand corner here, we're going to just look at how that kind of extrapolated out for Amazon. And really, we can see how Amazon built their business with online commerce and started out with selling books online and began to expand into other areas. But what was actually happening on a people layer was that Amazon were essentially creating crazy economies by scale by lowering the cost structure, which resulted in much better prices for their customers. So they went online, they were able to give much better cost structures because they didn't have the overhead expenses of a typical brick and mortar business. They passed those lower cost structures on to their customers as better prices, which meant that more people began using Amazon because they were able to get goods for cheaper. And that meant that it was able to attract more sellers in light of that. So because they were getting more consumers and people buying products because it was cheaper, they attracted more sellers. And they've since gone and set up the Amazon FBA program. And you've got thousands and hundreds of thousands of merchants now who are selling through Amazon, making a full-time living. But what attracted them there in the first place was the fact that Amazon created that demand side economies of scale with all of the people actually coming and flocking to use their platform. And what this results in is even greater selection for customers and a viral loop that we can see in the bottom hand corner here, where the customer is experiencing such good value in terms of the selection that they have, as well as the prices, that that perpetuates the fact that more sellers want to get involved because there's more money to be made, which results in a lower cost structure and lower prices, and it's a self-fulfilling loop. So the idea essentially is that you want to set up something similar for your business. And I guess with setting something up manually to begin with, you want to think about the value that you're conveying for your end user and your unique selling point. But by creating an extremely valuable proposition for a user, you really want them to have a good experience of using your product or service, so that let's say in an online context, you're going to want them to begin creating user-generated content based on the experience that they have had for you. And by creating that user-generated content and sharing that on social channels, that's going to allow for their extended networks to begin seeing the content that they're creating, and thereby kind of create a growth loop where a percentage of your initial customers' networks are going to see the products and see the good word about your business and begin to feed back into the initial touch point of where your business is in terms of like the first experience they have of it. So let's take an example. So let's talk about the idea that a business comes into contact with, let's say, an e-commerce store, and you're selling razors online. If they come into contact with you, a person purchases a razor, they get their razor, they love the packaging, they love the experience of what the product is, they share a picture of that on Instagram, it goes on their profile, they tag you in it, a percentage of their network then sees the user-generated content that that person has created, and that allows for their extended network to see that. And a percentage of their network sees that, they decide to check out your Razor brand. They in turn click on the link, go to your website, and then that's the closing of the loop, where the initial customer came in and found your site, purchased the product, created the user-generated content, shared it with their network, and now a percentage of their network is beginning to kind of feed back into clicking on the link, finding your product for the first time, and then going through that cycle. And not everybody is going to create user-generated content based on your product or service, but that's up to you to decide, okay, what are the variables here? What can I control? How much value can I deliver for these customers? And can I incentivize them to create user-generated content with my product or service so that they do share it with their networks? So again, I think the real lesson here is that we can think about how setting up that viral loop or that flywheel effect is going to work for you and your business based on your product or service offering. But by creating a positive feedback loop, you build momentum, and the increasing payoff is incremental over time, as we have seen with an example such as Amazon. So again, it's another model just to think about, and think about how you can structure your product or service to gain the benefits of a flywheel effect that might be leveraging user-generated content. Next mental model to look at is Agile Development. And this is a model that is really taken from Agile software development, but the term Agile is now so applicable to so many startup businesses and any business really, because in the context of setting up something online, again, the tech space is so fast moving that you almost need to be agile as a fundamental principle just to be able to develop your product or service offering and continue to be able to stay top of mind for users. So the term agile is applicable, I think, no matter what type of business that you're building, and it really comes back to some of the core traits that are associated with agile development, such as adaptive planning, evolutionary development, early delivery, continual improvement, all while remaining flexible and responding to change. So these are all principles of what agile development is about. And in the context of software development and software delivery, I think it's interesting to think about how these operate. And the model below kind of puts that out very plainly, in that the 5 steps to follow are plan, design, build, test, and review. But as we know, there's a feedback loop here that's happening, and doing this on an iterative basis, and obviously, like we mentioned, evolutionary development is what we really want to get at in terms of the continuous improvement approach that we want to take with how we're building out whatever product or service we're building. It's never going to be a one and done. It's a constant evolutionary approach that we want to think about, and how can we instill that kind of agile mindset within what we're doing? And I think this is a very simple way to think about it and approach it. And especially when it comes to trying to solve some of the problems, especially more of the macro problems in your business and what you want to work towards, it's great to have a model like this to reference and say, okay, let's do this experiment. Let's plan it, design it, build it. And then at least we know we can test and review what worked and what didn't at the end of that, and feed that into an improved version of what we want to do the second time around. So forcing functions is the final one we're going to look at here. And again, this is a very simple way to just think about how you can put some skin in the game on some of the outcomes or KPIs that you're looking for as a business. So a forcing function is any task, activity, or event that forces you to take action and produce a result. So I like to think about this in the context of creating KPIs or trying to think about the outcomes that you want to achieve as a business. And then a forcing function is essentially like the catalyst that changes your default behavior in the future by aligning your short-term incentives with your long-term goals. Again, you will get added benefits of the compounding effects of this over time. And what the forcing function is doing is it's basically saying you're going to put a commitment up front and say, okay, if I do not complete this task by a certain date, there is certain ramifications that I need to face because of it. And it's really a way of helping keep yourself accountable, and a way of keeping your KPIs measurable and working towards those outcomes. Because oftentimes I think we can get caught up in the sometimes in the creative component of things with your business, but we do need those outcomes and large KPIs to work towards for some of the larger tasks and objectives that we're trying to do. So an example of a forcing function might be to set a product feature launch date in the future and share that publicly. So you could say that we will be releasing version 2 of our website on December 31st, and you share that publicly, and you have a coming soon banner. And by doing that and sharing it publicly, you're keeping yourself and you're keeping your development team and your whole business accountable towards having that product ready, launched, and everything done by that target date. And a second example maybe would be making a significant financial investment in productivity and collaboration software for your team. So if your outcome is to be more productive and more collaborative as a business for as an internal team, then by making a significant investment in a productivity software tool, you essentially are forcing yourself and your team to begin to create economies of scale by learning that software, starting to use it on a daily and weekly basis, and then monitoring how your productivity is improving over time. But again, the incentive there is that you've realized that there's a problem, you're not being productive enough. You can make an investment in a particular software tool and begin to incorporate that into the business and incentivize yourself and your team to become more productive. So ultimately, it's kind of like a hedge. It's kind of a way of forcing you to to stick to your KPIs and your outcomes, and protecting against Parkinson's law, which says that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. So again, it's a very simple concept, and I think it's something a lot of people do anyway, but it's a nice reminder to have something that you can say, okay, let's create some forcing functions for some of the KPIs that we have over the next 3, 6, 12 months, and use that as something to work towards. So key lessons from the workshop that we've just ran through. I think the three big takeaways for me are decision-making, building your lattice, and then perspective. So from a decision-making standpoint, mental models, like we said, they're not going to overhaul your business completely, but they can absolutely aid your thought processes and decision-making on a daily basis. Building your lattice is going to essentially allow you to combine different mental models together. Think about which ones are relevant in which scenarios, but again, by having a more rich database and more rich set of mental models that you can reference, it means that you are hopefully improving your decision-making capabilities as a business leader or as a business owner. And then also by hopefully sharing those with your team internally and with others that you come in contact with, you are able to increase the productivity and output for everyone involved in growing your business. And then finally, perspective. It's about approaching the decisions you're making on a daily and weekly basis with the perspective of multiple reference points and multiple frameworks. And every individual mental model is just one view of reality. And it's worth remembering that, I think, because we face a lot of challenging situations in everyday life and in business. And I think it would be simple to be able to summarize everything into one model, but I think every model does hold some form of truth, but none of them contain the complete truth. And it's worth remembering that as you approach different problems and think about how you want to approach decision making, because yes, you'll be able to find some element of truth, and does a particular mental model apply in a certain situation, and oftentimes you'll be able to see that part of it does, and this situation might be different than what I need to experience or the decision I need to make for something else next week. But the means by which you are going to be able to essentially make decisions is going to be informed by the number of mental models that you're able to reference and the decision-making power, hopefully, that's associated with those. So I think they are the key takeaways about mental models. Again, they're a great framework to be able to reference and to be able to have as part of your decision-making repertoire. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And that is our workshop complete on mental models for running your business.